Welcome to the Regulating AI podcast, where we talk to leaders from diverse backgrounds around the world who help us fair, responsible AI regulations and governance around the world. I am joined by Professor Ted Lechterman, Assistant Professor at IE University and the UNESCO Chair for AI on Ethics. Professor, welcome to the Regulating AI podcast.
Thank you, Sanjay. Really nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Wonderful. Ted, you have an interesting background, especially in politics. One of the key areas, I'm based in Washington. We have an election coming up in a month's time. That people worry a lot about is the confluence of AI on democratic institutions. And you have a lot of background in there. Can you tell our audience what should we be concerned about regarding those kinds of things?
Sure. I know that many people are worried about AI being used to promote disinformation, deepfakes, synthetic content, etc., all of which can be a threat to the integrity of electoral processes, which are, in some ways, a core element of a democratic society and central to realizing the value of democracy. I think that is, for the most part, commonly understood. My own perspective is to think a little bit deeper about what democracy means in a broader sense and how AI might help us to better realize that value, as well as pose certain threats to that value, which may not be fully on our radar.
So let's just parse what you just said. How would AI help us realize the potential of our democratic values? Then we'll come about to the negative part a little bit later.
Sure. Well, for instance, some people are thinking about how AI might allow us to close certain longstanding democratic deficits or to augment the functioning of democratic processes and institutions. So if access to AI gives people a source of knowledge to fact check, for instance, political statements, allows them opportunities to strengthen their own understanding of political positions, arguments, ideologies, through perhaps deliberation with an AI assistant, those might be ways of closing certain democratic deficits where we have inequalities in education, inequalities in access to high quality information. Those are a couple of ways in which we can think about using AI as an augmentation or a tool for enhancing democratic processes or better realizing democratic values.
So what you're saying is it can do robust fact checks. It can improve from an educational standpoint. The issue, Ted, is that more and more, especially in the United States, we see that people's views are kind of baked in. And some of it is social media and some of it is just the way the world is working right now. Do you think AI can help in changing some of those perspectives, whatever spectrum of views you are on? People now, so to speak, have become tribal in nature. They listen to what they want to, and you have social media and other folks talking to them, and they just keep, getting enhanced on those things. Do you think AI could help change some of that?
It's certainly conceptually possible, right? So of course we have echo chambers, we have filter bubbles, we have confirmation bias. We're very biased towards the views that we already hold to some extent. But I can at least imagine having an AI tool that challenges my pre-existing beliefs, my prejudices, my biases. A tool that red teams me, that red teams my political preferences, my judgments, my ideologies, my party preferences, etc., and forces me to reckon with alternative perspectives, forces me to reckon with gaps in my logic, right? Forces me to better define and determine whether I can fully endorse upon full reflection some of the beliefs that I started with. So I certainly see this as a conceptual possibility, whether there's actually, an interest in developing technology in this way, whether the right incentives are in place, whether this could be captured, whether voters or citizens or consumers would actually want to use this. Those are questions I don't really have the expertise to decide. But I do see a certain conceptual possibility for using AI as a red teaming and cognitive strengthening tool, which could have useful democratic political purposes.
So a red team co-pilot, so to speak, is what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Ted, do you think, you know, large social media AI companies say, hey, we are doing a lot on content moderation, we are doing a lot on safeguards, etc. Do you think they would have an interest in something like this?
It's possible. I don't understand the ins and outs of social media platform business models.
Sure.
Certainly, I know social media companies are very worried about their reputation, and many of them do have an authentic interest in promoting democratic capabilities, or at least preventing the erosion of democracy at their own hands. So I could imagine social media companies being interested in developing technology in this way. I guess I had in mind further developments of some of the AI assistants that are already being produced by companies like OpenAI, Anthropic, these sort of generative AI chatbots, which more and more people are using to produce content, to engage in searches, to ask questions of. I could imagine further developments of this technology in a democratic spirit to help us understand some of the foundations of our beliefs and make stronger political decisions.
No, so the other thing, Ted, when I talk to experts on disinformation or election or other stuff, what they say, or deepfakes, they say we always had deepfakes in the past, but the scale and speed of what AI can do is just unimaginable, where it can produce thousands of videos at one prompt or a keystroke before you could not. Now, obviously, Ted, your viewpoint is also that you could do the opposite of those things too, in terms of fact checks and things of that nature. So what you're saying, Ted, is that we should have technology that counterbalances some of these things. Do you think organizations, whether it's a UNESCO, which you are associated, or multilateral organizations, have a role to play in something like this, Ted?
Absolutely. And I think the role of multilateral organizations, and more broadly thinking about civil society organizations, becomes incredibly important when we're thinking about contexts in the world which have fragile democratic institutions, or in some cases, no democratic institutions at all. Right? Those are places where we need second best solutions, where we need temporary transitional measures. And I think organizations like UNESCO, like other UN bodies, regional associations like the African Union, the ASEAN Network, or Organization for American States, these are all entities that could play a vital role in helping to shore up democratic infrastructure, to leverage the benefits of AI for democratic purposes, and ensure that input into or governance over AI is democratically managed, while we are waiting for the development of more sort of indigenous democratic institutions in countries that lack them.
No, I think that's a great point. You talked about ASEAN and other organizations. Ted, one of the things that is being seen over the past 2 years, where AI has become a geopolitical issue, and there's a term called AI nationalism, where a lot of countries now say, hey, we want to build our own AI system. So it's like, we don't, before they were not part of the nuclear club, we don't end up not being part of the AI club, so to speak. How do you see that as an approach? Is that helpful? Should every country have its own AI system? Should AI be a geopolitical issue? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, there are different ways to think about it. And I don't have a perspective on the national security question, which I think is at the heart of many of these kinds of arguments. I leave that kind of conversation to the security experts. But one thing I have been thinking about is this concept of sovereignty, which really is essential to the value of democracy. It's important that the world that we live in and the world that we create together is in part of our own making. It is something that's subject to our control. And something I worry about is that, most of the world is receiving technology created by a handful of companies located in the global north, right? Companies like OpenAI, like Anthropic, Google, Microsoft, etc., all located in basically the same place, extracting data from another place and imposing that technology, not always unwillingly, onto the rest of the world. So I think there's a case to be made, given how powerful this technology is, given the number of things that it can do, given the effects that it has over people's lives. There's a case to be made for this idea of indigenous AI, or at least shifting greater control over AI to other parts of the world so that people have a bit more opportunity to shape the course of their own lives. So yes, I can imagine at least a sort of democratic sovereignty-based argument for a certain kind of AI nationalism, where wherever we are, we have some input into the terms on which AI operates in our particular region.
So Ted, you touched on some important points. AI is kind of driven, as you said, in a select part, to be very blunt, Silicon Valley and maybe a few other places around the world for a variety of reasons. There are places in the world which are worried that uh, the AI is not going to remember, history will not remember their languages, their customs, their traditions, whether it's small countries, tribal folks, whether it's in Africa, whether it's in dialects in India, whether it's in smaller countries like Finland, etc. What do you think can be done about this? Should multilateral organizations be involved in this, or is this an important thing? You talked about the Global South. The Global South is, so to speak, and depends what your definition of China is that in Global South or not, but
Right.
they're not in this discussion, so to
Right.
speak.
Yeah, the linguistic inequality question is huge, right? It's certainly the case that all of these foundation models were trained principally on English.
Yep.
They perform much better on English, even when they are deployed to make decisions about or to engage with people who do not speak English, right? And so that's a very significant problem, especially if we're using these models or their applications to make high stakes decisions, maybe in a public sector context, a public administration context, law enforcement, immigration decisions, etc. Right. And then, of course, when it just comes to being able to use these tools as a consumer or in business, of course, it's important that these tools be able to operate in a variety of different languages. So sure, there's a role certainly for multilateral organizations, for different entities to assist. There are a couple of interesting projects already in development, right? So I believe the Barcelona Supercomputing Center is developing a native LLM on a variety of Spanish languages, which would be the first time that a very large language model had been trained on several different Spanish languages. There are projects going on in Peru to try to create an AI chatbot based in the Quechua language, so that Quechua speakers can interact with AI tools, and also as a way of preserving the Quechua language, which is at risk of dying out. Google, in fact, has added translation options in Google Translate for a variety of indigenous languages, which again is a way of helping to preserve these languages and ensure that they don't die out. So I agree that this question of linguistic justice becomes quite important when we're talking about large language models, which at least at the beginning have been trained predominantly on English and then projected onto the rest of the world.
No, so we need to keep bringing this up so that those things happen. Ted, you had written a book, I think, called Tyranny of Philanthropy, if I'm not mistaken.
Tyranny of Generosity.
Generosity.
That's right.
Now, let's just take that forward. Do you think what's happening in AI with these big tech companies in terms of saying, hey, we are doing this as a nonprofit or a B corporation, etc. Do you see any parallels in AI with what you've written? Maybe I'm giving you a suggestion to write another book, but any thoughts on that?
No, you're not mistaken. My work on AI was more or less directly motivated by my previous work on philanthropy, right? I think both philanthropy and AI offer us, tremendous possibilities and opportunities, and come with often very benevolent intentions of improving the world, offering us new opportunities, in some cases solving pertinent inequalities. But both of these processes, both of these tools, both of these practices also involve very significant exercises of power. They involve exercises of power by private entities who are not necessarily under significant public control, and they involve significant inequalities within those private communities between big players and small players. So I think scrutinizing the foundations of power is the sort of thread that knits these two research projects together. And it's one thing to assess intentions, and another thing to assess, how power is exercised and who holds it.
Well, listeners, wait for a new part two coming from Ted on this very important topic in Amazon. But Ted, coming to the point of, where we see, organizations like UNESCO and others, where you talk about equity and things of that nature. We've got now the EU AI Act. The US doesn't have any legislation. There are some states that have rules. We have this NIST framework. We have an executive order. China has its own things. What is your view? Should there be some kind of a harmonization of AI rules, regulations, standards? Give us some thought to our audience on that.
I don't know if I have a fully worked out perspective on that question. I mean, what we need minimally is strong regulations covering each region of deployment, right? Then there might be a separate question about harmonization at a later stage. But there are so many places in the world right now where regulation is severely underdeveloped, right? Where there are still many lingering questions about how this technology should be used, what safety restrictions are appropriate, and also who should have an opportunity to influence the development or governance of that technology. So that, I would say, would be my priority for where we should be focusing our attention. Filling the existing regulatory gaps, public policy gaps in AI governance, and also maybe thinking at a second stage about harmonization and coordination at the global level.
So fill in the current gaps, and then you can think about harmonization per se. Ted, thank you so much for taking the time. Your perspective on democracy, which is, as I said, a big concern because we have elections, but there are elections happening around the world. Democratic institutions are vulnerable, especially with the scale and speed of AI. And I think your work is very, very important, and our listeners are really thankful for your perspective. So thank you for being on the podcast.
Oh, my pleasure, Sanjay. A real pleasure to talk to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Ted.